They laughed at her when she dumped frogs into the irrigation ditches, until the soil itself came back to life. Maya Sterling inherited from her father a farm weighed down by debt, a piece of land completely exhausted, and the distrust of everyone around her. What no one expected was that the solution she would find to save it all would come from inside a tattered notebook, handwritten by a man who knew that soil better than any engineer. On a cold July morning, with the wind blowing straight at her, and the sky heavy with thick dark clouds, she stopped the truck at the edge of the irrigation ditches, opened the tailgate, and began releasing hundreds of frogs into the muddy waters of the canal. Workers from neighboring properties stopped to watch. Some laughed out loud. Others shook their heads with that mix of pity and scorn that hurts more than any direct insult. "She's finally lost her mind," one of them shouted from a distance, cupping his hands around his mouth to make sure everyone heard. Maya didn't answer. She didn't turn her face toward the voice. Her eyes were fixed on the canal, following each frog as it plunged into the murky water, as if each one of those little animals carried with it a piece of what she had promised her father before he left forever. She wasn't acting on impulse. She wasn't acting out of desperation, though the desperation was real and had been growing inside her chest for months like a stubborn weed. What she was doing on that cold morning was the result of sleepless nights, of pages and pages read and reread, of a gamble she had made with herself when everything else already seemed lost. And what was at stake was everything. The farm had a name, Good Promise Farm, which Maya's father had chosen decades earlier with a certainty she had never questioned as a child. The name felt right when she was little and ran along the paths between the cornrows, when the smell of wet earth after the rain filled her lungs with something nameless that yet seemed to belong to her. Her father had chosen the name one afternoon he always told about with the same smile, when Maya's mother was pregnant with Chloe and he had planted the first row of corn on that new land, looked out at the horizon and said out loud that that place had promised him something he still couldn't name, but felt deep in his chest like a certainty. Good Promise. The name had come from that. Now that same name sounded like a cruel joke. The promise had withered along with the last 3 harvests. It wasn't nature's fault. Well, not entirely nature's. The tenant farmer her father had hired years before, when his health no longer allowed him to manage things alone, had used the soil with a greed that took Maya too long to understand. Excessive agrochemicals, ignored crop rotation, the irrigation ditches treated like sewers instead of living arteries. When the tenant left, he took the profit and left the land exhausted, hard as concrete in some spots, with the canals clogged by mosquito larvae that prevented any proper water flow, and her father had fallen ill before he could fix anything. Maya was 32 years old when she buried him. At the time, she worked in Chicago as an administrative assistant in an office with air conditioning and meetings on Wednesdays. It wasn't a bad life, but when she read the will and understood that the farm came along with a considerable bank debt her father had taken on trying to restore the soil before he got sick, she stood still in the middle of the living room of her childhood home for a long time, staring at the walls, not knowing what to do. She threw away the apartment lease in the city 3 weeks later. Old man Caleb, the longest-serving farmhand, was on the porch when she arrived with her suitcases. He was about 60 years old, shoulders stooped from the weight of many harvests, hands that seemed made of the very soil he cultivated. He looked at her with a mix of relief and pity, like someone who sees reinforcements arriving, but knows they might not be enough. "I'll help you however I can, Maya," he said, using the nickname that no one else used anymore. "But you need to know the situation is bad." "I know," she replied and went inside the house. The first thing she did was go to her father's room. The room still smelled of him, that scent of earth and bar soap she'd breathed her entire childhood without noticing, and that now hit her like a gentle blow to the center of her chest. The bed was made exactly as Mr. Caleb had fixed it after her father left, the sheets stretched with a care that seemed like respect. On the wall, an old calendar that her father had never taken down, because it was from the year the farm had its best harvest ever. She stood staring at that calendar for a second before opening the drawer. In the dresser drawer, under a pile of documents, was the notebook. It was a dark green hardcover notebook, with worn edges and some pages warped from moisture. Her father had filled it over decades with notes about the farm, the soil, the weather, the animals. Maya had flipped through it once right after the funeral, unable to focus on the reading. It had been too soon. The pain was still raw, and her father's words on the page slipped past her eyes without sinking in. Now she opened it again, more calmly, with the willingness of someone who knows they might need help from the least expected place. On the first pages, there were crop records, rainfall dates, observations about pests. In the middle pages, reflections on techniques he'd tried that had worked or failed. But on the last pages, written in different handwriting, smaller and more tremulous, there was something that stopped Maya mid-breath. Her father had written about the frogs, not casually. He had precisely recorded when the amphibian population in the ditches began to disappear, the period that coincided with the tenants' first pest control campaigns. And he had documented, with the patience of someone observing the same thing for years, that before the frogs vanished, the water in the canals was clearer. Mosquito larvae were naturally controlled, and the soil along the ditches remained looser and more permeable. On the very last page, in the weakest handwriting of all, he had written a single sentence. "When the frogs vanish from the ditches, the land begins to die." Maya read that sentence 3 times. Then she closed the notebook, leaned it against the cushion, and stared at the ceiling until the sun set outside. In the following days, she dived into the notes with an intensity that even startled Mr. Caleb, who saw her awake when he arrived early in the morning and still awake when he passed by the lit window at dinner time. "Are you sleeping, Mum?" he asked once, raising an eyebrow. "I'm sleeping enough," she replied without taking her eyes off the notebook. It wasn't true, but it was all she had to offer. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. What her father had described in the notebooks wasn't a crazy theory. It was a careful observation made over years of a biological balance that existed before it was destroyed. The frogs ate the larvae. The consumed larvae kept the ditch water clean. The clean water irrigated the soil better. The well-irrigated soil sustained the crops. It was a simple chain, the kind that seems obvious when someone explains it, but that almost no one bothers to see. Maya started researching. There wasn't fast internet at the farm, so I'd drive to the library in the nearest small town and spend hours looking through books on biodynamic agriculture, biological pest control, and restoring degraded soil. The librarian, a white-haired woman named Mrs. Evelyn, started setting aside materials for her before she even arrived. "You're Mr. Silas's daughter, right?" the woman asked one day with a smile that held something back. "I am," Maya replied. "Did you know him?" "He came here sometimes. Very quiet, your father. But when he talked about the land, it was hard to stop listening. That stuck with Maya for days. The idea that her father had come to that library alone, researching, searching, trying to save something he no longer had the strength to save with his own hands. The visit to the bank came before she was ready. The manager's name was Julian, a man in his 50s with dark-framed glasses and a way of speaking that always seemed to be reading from an invisible script in front of him. He listened patiently as Maya talked about the soil restoration plan, her father's notebooks, the possibility of reintroducing frogs into the ditches. When she finished, he took off his glasses, cleaned the lens with the tip of his shirt and said, "Miss Sterling, I understand your attachment to the property, but what you've described to me isn't a restoration plan I can present as collateral. The loan term expires in 90 days. If there's no payment or renegotiation with real collateral, the process will move forward." She left the meeting with the feeling that the walls were closing in. In the bank hallway, before reaching the door, she found Vance Thorne waiting on a wooden bench against the wall. He was a middle-aged man, well-dressed, with graying hair at the temples and a thick wedding band on his finger. His land surrounded Good Promise Farm on 3 sides. For years he had been trying to buy the property for a price that anyone from outside would recognize as far below its value. "Miss Sterling," he said, standing up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. What a coincidence. It was no coincidence, and they both knew it. "Vance," she greeted, her voice flat. "My offer still stands," he said, without beating around the bush. "But it has a deadline. If you decide after the bank takes action, the price will be different, lower for sure. I'll think about it, she said, and walked out the door without looking back. In the truck, with her hands on the wheel and the engine still off, she sat still for a moment. Then she started the car and drove away. Back at the farm, Mr. Caleb was trimming the hedge near the gate. She stopped the truck beside him and got out. "Caleb, where around here can we get frogs?" He stopped trimming. He looked up at her with that expression she had learned to recognize as the precursor to a long pause before any answer. "Frogs, Miss Meyer?" "Frogs. A lot of them. Alive." Another pause. "There's an abandoned pond at the back of Old Man Silas's property. It flooded when he diverted the creek and he never used it again. It's full of critters. Frogs, toads, all sorts of things. Will Old Man Silas let me take them? Old Man Silas is 82 and doesn't care about anything happening on his land anymore. His daughter looks after it, but she lives far away. You can go over there and take them, and he won't even know." Maya went the next afternoon with buckets and a burlap sack and spent 3 hours collecting frogs from a pond that smelled of mud, with mosquitoes buzzing around her face. Old Man Silas's pond was bigger than she expected. Hidden behind a low thicket she had to clear a path through. The water was green and still, and the life inside it was noisy even during the day, with frogs of various sizes resting on the rocks and diving in as she approached. She worked carefully, without rushing, with the care of someone handling something both fragile and necessary. The buckets filled slowly. At times she paused and just stared at the water, trying to understand what her father had understood before her, what those small, unassuming creatures meant in a chain larger than themselves. She returned with mud-stained clothes, her arms scratched from the bushes, and buckets full of small, hopping life that she poured carefully into the most eroded ditches. Each frog that fell into the canal water and disappeared into the murky depths felt like an investment in something that still had no visible shape. She stood at the edge of the canal for a while after finishing, watching the silence settle back in after the last frog splashes. Nothing happened right away, of course. She knew it wouldn't. But something inside her settled that afternoon, like soil that stopped sliding after the rain. It was the feeling of having done what was right, not necessarily what was easy, and of having done it with her own hands. That kind of certainty doesn't solve a bank problem, but it sustains a person while the bank problems are still waiting to be fixed. The weeks that followed brought a loneliness she hadn't expected to feel so intensely. The farm was vast, the silence heavy, and the neighbors' comments reached her in indirect ways, by the way the workers from surrounding properties avoided eye contact when they met her on the road, by the tone of the grocery store clerk's voice when she asked if Maya needed anything else, as if the question carried a hint of condescension. She called her sister one afternoon, more out of a need to hear a familiar voice than because she had anything specific to say. Chloe lived in a bigger city, worked as a dental assistant, had 2 children and a husband she rarely mentioned without an impatient sigh. They had been close as kids, distant as adults, and the distance had grown in recent years as their father's illness took center stage. "I'm calling to see how you're doing," Maya said. "I'm fine," Chloe replied, in a tone that said otherwise. "It's you I don't understand. Mrs. Mabel from the butcher shop texted me saying you're throwing frogs into the canal. Is that true?" Maya closed her eyes for a second. "It's true." "Maya, for heaven's sake." "Chloe, let me explain." "There's no need to explain. I just need you not to make us the laughingstock of the whole area. Mum's already embarrassed to leave the house." The mention of their mother hit the mark. Their mother, Mrs. Martha Sterling, had moved to the nearest small town to the farm after becoming a widow, and lived in a 2-room house that depended on a monthly supplement Maya had promised to keep up. With the farm collapsing and the salary she had left behind, that commitment was becoming harder and harder to honor. "I'll handle it," Maya said, with more firmness than she felt. "Trust me." Chloe was silent for a moment. "I do trust you, Maya. But trust doesn't pay the bills." The call ended without warm goodbyes. That night, lying in the bed that had been her father's, Maya stared at the ceiling for hours. She counted her problems like someone counting sheep. The bank debt with a 90-day deadline, the land that needed time to recover, and time she didn't have. The mother who depended on her, the sister who didn't understand, the neighbors who laughed, Vance Thorne waiting on the sidelines like a vulture. And there was one problem she still hadn't solved: how to prove that what she was doing was actually working. The next day she woke up before sunrise and went straight to the yard. Mr. Caleb arrived at 6 in the morning and found her sitting on the edge of the ditch with her father's notebook in her lap. "Caleb, do you know anyone around here who has worked with soil recovery? Someone who really understands it, not just planting?" He scratched his head. "There's a retired teacher who lives out in Willow Creek, about 60 miles from here, Mrs. Agatha. I heard about her once when I went to a talk the Farmers Cooperative put on. She worked for years with biological pest control out in the countryside, but I don't know if she's still taking on clients. Do you have her contact?" "I've got her name. The rest you can figure out." It took 2 days and a lot of phone calls before Maya Sterling got a phone number for Mrs. Agatha. When she called, the voice that answered was firm, direct, with a thick country accent. "Who is it?" "My name is Maya Sterling. I own a farm here in the area that's in the middle of soil recovery using biological control. I have my father's observation notebooks, which documented decades of soil and animal behavior on the property. I need someone who understands what I'm trying to do." Silence on the other end. "Reintroduction of control fauna?" the woman asked. "Frogs, mostly, in the irrigation ditches." Another silence, longer this time. "Send me the photos of the ditches by message. I'll take a look at what it is." Maya sent the photos that same afternoon, her heart beating faster than it should have as she waited for a reply. The reply took 2 days. When it came, it was short. "I'll come by on Thursday, at 8 in the morning." During those 2 days of waiting, the situation at the farm got complicated in a way Maya hadn't foreseen. Mr. Caleb showed up one morning with his hat in his hand, which she had already learned was a bad sign. "Ms. Maya, I need to talk to you." They sat down on the porch. She poured coffee that was cold because she'd left the kettle on the fire too early. "I've got trouble at home," he said, holding the coffee cup with both hands without drinking. "My wife keeps asking me every night what I'm doing out here. The boys are hearing talk in town. The oldest asked me yesterday if it was true I worked at the crazy frog lady's farm." Maya didn't say anything. "I don't think you're crazy," he went on quickly, as if he needed to make that clear before anything else. "But I'm getting to where I can't defend what we're doing because I don't really understand myself what's going to happen. And without understanding, it's hard to explain. I understand, Caleb, and there's more. My brother-in-law offered me a steady job at the building supply warehouse in town, with a formal contract. The silence that followed lasted too long. "You need to go," she said finally, and her voice came out firmer than she expected. "You've got a family to support. You have no obligation to this farm." "I have an obligation to Mr. Silas," he said, his eyes welling up in a way he was clearly struggling to control. "I worked here for 32 years, and my father would be proud of you for staying that long. But now you go." Mr. Caleb left that afternoon. Maya stood at the gate, watching his truck drive away down the dirt road until it disappeared in the dust, and then she turned to the farm and looked at everything that was hers, and that seemed, in that moment, far too big for one person. She had 2 temporary workers hired to help with the basics, but neither of them knew the property like Mr. Caleb did. Neither of them would know where the soil was firmer, where water tended to puddle, at what time of year the wind changed direction, and how that affected irrigation. That night she didn't sleep. She stayed on the porch until dawn, listening to the distant croaking of the frogs that had already settled in some stretches of the ditches, and trying to find, in that small, persistent sound, something that felt like a promise. Thursday arrived with an overcast sky and a cold wind that bent the tips of the dry grass along the banks of the channels. Mrs. Agatha showed up at 8 on the dot, driving an old car that squeaked when it stopped in front of the gate. She got out slowly, a woman around 65 with short white hair, thin-rimmed glasses, wearing cotton pants, and a long-sleeved blouse that seemed chosen for practicality, not appearance. She looked at the farm with an attention that Maya recognized as professional. It wasn't the look of someone admiring a landscape. It was the look of someone already working. "Show me the ditches," she said, without a long greeting. They walked along the channels for over an hour. Mrs. Agatha stopped at specific spots, bent down, observed the water, the banks, the vegetation that was growing or dying around them. At times, she pulled a small magnifying glass from her pocket and examined something Maya couldn't make out with the naked eye. She barely spoke during the entire walk. When they returned to the porch, she sat down, accepted the coffee, which this time was hot, and stayed silent for a time that felt much longer to Maya than it actually was. "Your father was an extraordinary observer," she said at last. "Those notes you sent me. I worked 20 years in biological control and rarely saw anything so precise done by someone without technical training." Maya felt something loosen in her chest. "And what did you see in the ditches?" she asked. "I saw the beginning of a process, very early still. But the frogs are establishing themselves in some stretches, and where they are, you can already see a difference in the density of larvae. It's small, but it's real. I have 90 days to show results to the bank." Mrs. Agatha took a sip of coffee. 88 now, she corrected, with an objectivity that was more encouraging than any kind words. "And there's a problem you need to know about." She pointed toward Vance Thorne's land, which bordered the farm on the east side. "Do you know what he plants?" "Soybeans, mostly. Sometimes corn." "And when does he apply pesticides?" Maya thought. "I'm not sure. At the end of the month sometimes, depends on the crop. Because if he applies them the way I suspect he does, and the drift falls into your ditches, you'll lose part of what you've built. Frogs are sensitive. It doesn't take much to affect them." That information hung heavy in the air. "Is there a way to prevent it?" "There's a way to try asking, or to document it in case he doesn't cooperate." Mrs. Agatha left at the end of the afternoon, but before she left, she said she'd return in 2 weeks to assess the progress, and that she had an old colleague, a researcher named Arthur who worked with degraded soil recovery, who might be interested in the situation. Maya thanked her with a restraint that hid how much those words had relieved something inside her. That night, she went to the border with Vance Thorne's land. She stood still near the fence, looking at the neighbor's crops in the dark, and thought about how she would talk to him. It wouldn't be easy. It never had been. She waited 3 days before deciding to go. She took the truck, drove to the main house of Vance's farm, which was larger and better kept than hers, and asked to speak with the owner at the gate. The employee made her wait 15 minutes on the roadside before Vance appeared, with his sleeves rolled up, wearing that smile she knew well. What a surprise, Mrs. Maya came to reconsider the offer. "I came to ask for something," she said, straight to the point. "Go ahead and ask. The next pesticide application you do on the east side crops, I need you to wait at least 3 weeks, or use something that doesn't drift as much." Vance's smile didn't change, but his eyes did. "I can't compromise my production because of a neighbor's experiment," he said, with a false lightness that was worse than harshness. "It's not an experiment. It's soil recovery. And the drift from your products is reaching my ditches. My application is legal and follows all technical standards. If you have a problem with that, that's your problem." She looked at him for a second. "Fine," she said, and left. In the truck, with her hands on the wheel and her head boiling, she called Mrs. Agatha and told her what had happened. "Document everything," the woman said without hesitation. "Every application of his you can record, every sign of impact on your drainage ditches, every frog that disappears from where it was. Photo with a date, note with the time, just like your father used to do." Maya started that very same day. She bought a new notebook, the same size as her father's but with a blue cover, and began to write everything down. The date of each observation in the ditches, the estimated number of frogs in each stretch, the apparent quality of the water, any sign of the animal's presence or absence. She took photos with her cell phone, kept it in the pocket of her work shirt, and recorded everything she saw with timestamps. It was in the middle of this process that the notification from the bank arrived. It wasn't a regular letter. It was a formal notice with a stamp and legal language informing her that the deadline had been revised. It was no longer 90 days. It was 60. She read the document 3 times, standing on the porch, with the late afternoon sun hitting the paper sideways. 60 days. The land had barely even begun to breathe. Maya went to sit on the porch steps and stared at the ditches down below, where the reflection of dark clouds flickered in the murky water. The frogs croaked somewhere she couldn't see, and the sound seemed too far away, too small, to carry the weight it needed to carry. That night, she decided she would go to the ditches at dawn. She didn't know exactly why, but there was a need to be close to that process, to feel it happening, even when no one was watching. She grabbed the big flashlight that was in the kitchen cabinet, put on her rubber boots and went. The dawn in the countryside has a different silence than the silence of the city. In the city, silence is the absence of noise. In the countryside, silence is full of things, of insects, of wind, of frogs, of something that has no name but that you feel on your skin. Maya walked slowly along the edge of the canal, shining the light on the water's edge, observing. She was so focused on the ditches that she didn't notice the spot on the bank that was slippery. Her right foot suddenly gave way. She tried to balance, but her body's weight had already passed the point of no return. She fell sideways, her shoulder hitting the muddy edge of the canal first, before she rolled into the water. The flashlight flew from her hand and fell into the canal along with her. The water was cold and dark. It was shallow, no more than a meter, but the impact was enough to leave her disoriented for a few seconds. She stood up, drenched, her shoulder throbbing with a sharp pain, and stood still in the middle of the canal for a moment, not knowing what to do. Her father's notebook was in her left hand, closed, but soaked. She got out of the canal slowly, climbed the bank carefully this time, and sat down on the ground. She opened the notebook. Some pages were stuck together. The ink from some of the notes had smudged. Not all of them, but some, including some of the last pages, where her father's shaky handwriting had left the most important observations. She stared at the smudged pages for a long time. She tried with her finger to separate the stuck pages with the care of someone handling something delicate, and she managed it for some of them. But there were parts that wouldn't come apart, that had fused together in the dampness, and that tore when she tried to force them. She stopped trying. She closed the notebook gently, holding it as if she were holding something she knew could break with too much pressure. The pain in her shoulder pulsed. The dawn cold seeped in through her soaked clothes, and the silence around her, that silence full of things, seemed to swallow everything, including her. For the first few minutes, she simply sat there, not thinking about a solution, not weighing an alternative, not making the mental checklist of things to do that had become a habit since she arrived at the farm. Just sitting on the dark floor, with the wet notebook in her lap, and the dark farm all around. For the first time since she had arrived at the farm, Maya Sterling truly thought about giving up. Not as an idea she immediately pushed away, but as a real possibility she allowed to sit beside her for a moment, look her in the eye, and ask, what if this is too big for you? What if her father had left a task meant for his hands, not hers? What if all this effort was the kind of thing you admire from afar in other people's stories, but that doesn't work in real life, in this specific life, with that deadline and that bank and that neighbor and that debt? She didn't answer. She let the question exist for a moment. Then she let it drift away, just as it came, without any ceremony. She sat on the dark floor, wet and aching, staring at the ponds in the night, until the frogs started croaking again after the fright of her fall. And there they were, those little animals she had gone to fetch from other people's reservoirs with buckets and a burlap sack, doing exactly what her father had written they did, existing in the place where she had put them, unaware of the debts, unaware of the deadlines, unaware of Vance Thorn waiting at the edge, just living, just doing what they knew how to do. She stood up without haste, carefully made her way back to the house along the firm edge of the canal, changed her clothes, dried the notebook carefully beside the wood stove, separating page by page as much as she could without tearing, and went to sleep. The next morning, the phone rang at 6:30. It was Mrs. Agatha. "I showed the photos I took on my visit to a colleague of mine," she said without preamble. "Professor Arthur, he was interested. He wants to visit the property." "When?" Maya asked, sitting on the edge of the bed, her shoulder still aching. "Whenever you want. He's available this week. The sooner, the better. Arthur arrived 2 days later on a Thursday morning. He was a man about 55 years old, reserved, unshaven, with a large backpack clinking with vials and equipment Maya didn't recognize. He spoke little, shook her hand firmly, and went straight to the ponds without asking for directions. He spent the entire day walking around the property, collected soil samples from different spots, took water samples from various stretches of the ponds, photographed with a different camera than a cell phone, more professional, with a lens she imagined magnified details the naked eye couldn't capture. At the end of the day, he sat at the kitchen table and said, "Something is happening here that I rarely manage to document in less than 30 days of process." Maya stayed quiet, waiting. "The frogs are working as you expected. In the stretches where the concentration is higher, I can already see a reduction in larvae and the beginning of improvement in water clarity. And at 2 spots along the banks, the soil is showing signs of permeability it shouldn't have yet. But is it enough to prove to the bank that the property is viable?" He thought before answering. "Not yet. But if I monitor it weekly and document the progress, in 30 days we would have data any technician would recognize as solid. The problem is time. I have 56 days. Arthur looked at her with an expression that wasn't pity, but was something close to it. "Then it needs to be fast and precise, and there can't be any outside interference." The outside interference arrived before she could prepare for it. One weekday morning, the wind shifted to the east and brought with it the unmistakable smell of pesticide. It was a scent she had learned to recognize during her weeks on the farm, that sweetish chemical odor that stuck to your nostrils. She went to the boundary line and saw in the distance Vance Thorne's tractor working with the sprayer on his crops. The drift was coming straight toward the ponds. She called Mrs. Agatha as she ran back to the most affected area. "I see it, Maya," the researcher said, with a calm that only exists in someone who has been through enough crises to learn that panic doesn't help. "Photograph everything, the tractor, the wind direction, the ponds, now." Over the following days, the effects appeared. In 2 stretches of the ponds where the frog population had begun to establish itself more densely, the numbers visibly decreased. Not everything disappeared, but the retreat was real. Arthur documented it with the data he had collected before and after, and the report he prepared was clear about the connection between the application and the impact. Maya stared at that report for a long time. Then she put on her coat, grabbed the truck keys and went to the town's farmers' cooperative. The cooperative office operated out of a small room that smelled of old paper, and a secretary handled calls with the phone wedged between her shoulder and ear while typing. Maya explained the situation to the chairman, a man named Franklin, who listened with an attention she hadn't expected to find. "It's not the first time I've heard this about Vance Thorne," he said at the end. "What do you mean?" "He had a neighbor about 4 years ago who lost half his orchard to pesticide drift. But he didn't want to make a fuss. He was afraid of the neighbor, of the consequences. He kept it to himself." "And now? Is there documentation?" "There might be. Let me make some calls." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us beginners. Now continuing, Maya returned to the farm with the feeling that she had set something in motion without knowing exactly where it would end. It was both relief and fear. That feeling you get when you throw a stone into a lake and wait to see the size of the ripples. That night, a little after 10, her phone rang with her sister's name on the screen. She took a deep breath before answering. "Hey, Chloe." "Hey." Her sister's voice was different, not nervous but careful, like someone choosing every word before speaking. "I'm calling because I need to tell you something before you find out some other way." Maya felt a cold knot in her stomach that wasn't from the wind. "Tell me." "Vance Thorne reached out to me." The silence that followed was heavy. "Reached out to you how?" Maya asked slowly. "Through our cousins. You know Grant married a woman who's a distant relative of Vance's family, so he got to me through that path. He called me, introduced himself, talked about the farm, the debt, the bank deadline, and what did he want?" Another pause. "He wanted me to sign a letter a letter that the property's heirs would send to the bank, stating that we agreed to the sale of the property to settle the debt. Chloe paused. Maya, I signed it. The silence that followed was of a different kind. It was the kind of silence that needs room to exist, because it contains something too big to fit alongside words. You signed? Maya repeated. It wasn't a question. I thought it was the right thing to do. He explained that the bank was going to foreclose anyway, that you'd lose everything for nothing, that if we sold beforehand, at least we'd get something. You signed without asking me. I tried to call you before, but you didn't answer. Once, Chloe, you tried once. Her sister's voice trembled a little. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. That's why I'm calling you now. I want to undo it. Can you undo a signature that's already at the bank? I can sign a retraction at least. I don't know if it'll get there in time, but I can try. Maya was silent for a time. She couldn't measure herself. Sign the retraction, she said finally. And don't call me tonight. I need some time. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand, looking at the wood stove that was cold. Then she went to the bedroom, lay down fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling in the dark. The betrayal of a stranger hurts one way. The betrayal of a sister hurts another way, deeper, in a place that has no name, but that you recognize immediately when it's struck. She cried that night. It wasn't the cry of resignation, of someone giving up. It was a cry of release, of someone carrying too much weight for too long and needing to let some of it go before moving on. She cried until she was dry, and then she lay in the dark listening to the frogs outside. The frogs croaking that night sounded different, fuller, more present. She fell asleep without realizing when. In the morning she woke up with the sun hitting her directly in the face, which meant she had slept longer than she had in months. The clock on the wall read 7:20, a time she hadn't seen in the morning without having woken up well before it, since she had arrived at the farm. Her face was swollen from the night's crying, her throat dry. She lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling. Her sister had signed a letter without asking. She let the weight of that exist for a full minute, without trying to fix it, without trying to understand, without inventorying the reasons that might or might not justify it. She just let it be. And then, like everything we let be without forcing, the weight became a little lighter. She lay there another minute, listing her problems as if it were a shopping list. Her sister's letter, the bank deadline, Vance's interference, Arthur needing more time, the mother who depended on the monthly supplement that was getting hard to secure, the money that had run out faster than she had calculated when she quit her job. It was a long list. Then she got up, washed her face with cold water, had a coffee she heated on the stove while putting on her rubber boots, and headed for the drainage ditches. What she saw made her stop in the middle of the farm road. In the oldest stretch, where she had released the first frogs weeks before, the water looked different. Not crystal clear, not from a distance, but visibly clearer than the day before. A clarity of someone starting to breathe again. The banks of that stretch showed different vegetation, greener, more alive. The kind that wasn't there a month ago. She stood looking for a long time. Then she took her phone out of her pocket and photographed it. She called Arthur immediately. I need you to come today. He came that same day in the early afternoon. He spent hours at the ditches, collecting samples, measuring, photographing. When he came back to the porch, there was something different in his expression. It wasn't exactly joy, but it was something adjacent to it. The eastern stretch is showing a reduction in larvae above what I calculated for this phase, he said, and the soil permeability on the banks of that channel. He paused, choosing his words. I'll need to process the samples to confirm, but what I'm seeing visually is promising, real. Is promising enough for the bank? Depends on how we present it, but if the sample data confirms what I'm seeing, it's a legitimate technical argument. Maya looked at him. How long do you need to process it? 5 days, maybe 6. I have 48 hours. He nodded. Then I'll do it in 4. In those 4 days, news came from everywhere at once, as it often does when a situation is at its breaking point before giving way. The first news came from the president of the Farmers' Cooperative, Franklin. The farmer who had lost part of his orchard years before, named Abraham, agreed to present the documentation he had kept about the incident with Vance. And there was a second producer, a poultry farmer named Wyatt, who had suffered a similar impact and was also willing to come forward formally. "You're not alone," Franklin said on the phone, "but you were the first who wanted to face it head-on." The second piece of news was from Chloe. She had signed the retraction and sent it to the bank by express delivery with return receipt. "It'll get there tomorrow," she said, in a voice that tried to sound neutral but couldn't. "I know it doesn't fix everything, but it was what I could do." "Thank you," Maya said. That was all. For now, it was enough. The third piece of news was unexpected. Mr. Caleb showed up at the farm gate on a Wednesday afternoon with his hat in hand, just like when he had asked to leave. She went to him, and the two of them stood at the edge of the road for a moment before anyone spoke. "I came to apologize," he said, "and I came to tell you something I heard. You can do both. I apologize first, because I left at the wrong time. I knew I was leaving you in a tight spot, but I was weak." He looked away to the ground. "Now, what I heard, I'm working at the supply depot. The boss is friends with a guy who works at the bank. And the other day, at lunch, that guy said in a group that Vance had made a deal with someone inside to be warned ahead of time about any movement in your farm's case, so he could position himself better to buy if things went south fast." Maya stayed quiet. "Did he say who it was?" she asked carefully. "No, but he said it was someone who handled the case directly." She looked at Caleb for a moment. "Are you coming back to work here?" He lifted his eyes from the ground. "If you want me to, I do." With Caleb back and Arthur's data being processed, Maya prepared for the meeting with the bank as carefully as she could. She gathered her father's notebook, the date and time-stamped photos, Arthur's preliminary report, Mrs. Agatha's report on the interference from Vance's pesticides, and the documentation Franklin had put together with the two other affected producers. It was a considerable stack of paper, and it was all true. She requested a meeting directly with the regional manager, who was one level above Julian, the local manager. The request took 2 days to be answered. When the phone call came confirming the date, she felt that particular mix of relief and terror that precedes the moments that define what comes next. The meeting took place on a Monday morning. Maya walked into the room with Arthur, who had agreed to attend. Mrs. Agatha waited outside, available if needed. The regional manager was a woman in her 50s named Miss Margaret, with a quiet elegance and a way of looking at you that made you feel you were being assessed with precision, not judgment. Maya presented everything. She started with her father's notebook, explained the logic behind reintroducing the frogs, showed the photos in chronological order, and then turned the floor over to Arthur, who presented the sample data with a technical precision that turned what seemed unlikely into something documented and concrete. Then she presented the report on the interference from Vance's pesticides, with the dates, the photographic records, and Mrs. Agatha's opinion, and then she put on the table the information Mr. Caleb had brought. "I have reason to believe there was an informal arrangement between the party most interested in buying the property and someone inside this institution aimed at gaining an advantage in the process," she said, without raising her voice. "I don't have documentary proof of that, but I have a witness to the account, and I'm formally recording that this information was presented at this meeting." Ms. Margaret remained still for a moment. Then she wrote something down on the notepad in front of her. "This information will be investigated internally," she said, with a firmness that wasn't defensive but serious. "What I can tell you now is that the process on your property will be temporarily suspended while the review of the technical documents is completed." Maya looked at Arthur. He gave a slight nod. "How long will the suspension last?" she asked. 30 days for the technical review. After that, we'll decide on the next steps." 30 days. It was short. It was almost nothing. But it was room to breathe. She left the bank with Arthur by her side under a Tuesday sun that felt different, warmer, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment without speaking. Mrs. Agatha was leaning against the car. She came to meet them. "How did it go?" the researcher asked. They suspended the process for 30 days for review, Maya replied. Mrs. Agatha looked at her with an expression that was hard to name. It wasn't euphoria. It was something more restrained, more real. Then we'll work hard these 30 days, she said, because 30 days fly by when you need them. Vance Thorne found out about the meeting through some channel Maya never discovered. The sign came 2 days later, when she saw his tractor from a distance, working again on the eastern boundary fields, this time closer to the property line than ever before. She called Franklin immediately. "He's doing this on purpose," she said. "I know," he replied. "But now we have more people watching. Abraham and Wyatt are also keeping an eye. Anything that happens will be documented by more than one witness. The impact on the drainage ditches came in 2 days, just like last time. But this time Arthur was there, with equipment, collecting samples before, during, and after. The documented timeline was irrefutable. When the report was ready, Franklin called a meeting at the farmers' cooperative. Maya, Arthur, Mrs. Agatha, Abraham with his old documents, Wyatt with his, and 3 other small local farmers who had appeared in the previous weeks, drawn by what they were hearing around the community, all attended. The matter had stopped being just hers. Vance Thorne sent a representative to the meeting, a lawyer in a suit who sat in the back of the room with a notepad and stayed quiet throughout the entire presentation. When the president of the cooperative asked the representative to speak, he said the accusations lacked legal basis and that his client would act within the legal rights of any rural property owner. Then he left before the meeting ended. As they were leaving, Maya stood at the door of the cooperative, talking to Abraham, a man of about 68, with sun-bronzed skin and a slow way of speaking that gave every word weight. "I've kept that document for 4 years, he said, looking at the folder in his hand. "My wife would ask me to throw it away every time she cleaned. She said I was holding on to grudges on paper." He smiled a little. "I held on to the grudge and held on to the paper." "Good thing," Maya said. "You reminded us that we don't have to take it lying down," he said. "That's worth more than the document." She returned to the farm that afternoon feeling, for the first time in a long time, that she wasn't alone. The following days were a non-stop grind. She and Caleb worked from early morning until nightfall, monitoring the ditches, tending the banks, doing what they could with the resources they had. Arthur stopped by the farm every 2 or 3 days. Mrs. Agatha stayed at the property for a week, sleeping in the guest room that had been closed up since Maya's mother's time. Having Mrs. Agatha at the farm during that week was something Maya hadn't realized she would need, but she recognized as necessary from that very first dinner. The researcher was one of those people who filled a room not by the volume of her voice, but by the quality of her attention. She listened in a way that made a person feel that what they were saying truly mattered, not out of politeness, but out of genuine interest. They cooked together at the end of the day, with Maya making what she knew, which was the basics, and Mrs. Agatha adding seasonings she pulled from a cloth sack she had brought in her luggage, like someone brings a lifelong habit. The smell of the kitchen that week was different from the weeks before, more lived in, as if the house were remembering it had once been full of people. That week, on the nights the two of them had tea on the porch after dinner, Maya gradually discovered that Mrs. Agatha was a woman with a lifetime of stories she told with the parsimony of someone who already understood that stories have more impact when they come out slowly. She had worked on various rural properties throughout her career, had published articles few had read, had tried to convince farmers and technicians that biological balance was more efficient than most of the poisons available on the market, and had spent decades hearing that she was wrong or that she theorized too much. And was she wrong? Maya asked one night. In some details, yes. Overall, no. She sipped her tea. The difference between science and stubbornness is that science changes when new evidence appears. Stubbornness never changes. I always preferred science even when it took its time proving me right. And Silas Sterling? Maya asked, referring to her father by the name Mrs. Agatha had used once. Did you know him? The researcher looked at her for a second with an expression that passed too quickly to be named. Not directly, but I knew his work, from what you showed me in the notebook. She paused. He had no formal training. But he had what training doesn't give, the patience to observe without interfering. That's rare. Maya was silent, looking at the dark gullies down below. "He taught me to be quiet near the land," she said. "When I was little, he would take me to the gullies and say, 'You don't need to say anything. Just look. The land talks if you let it.' He left that for you. I thought he had left a debt." "He left both things," Mrs. Agatha said, with an objectivity that was affectionate in its own way. "And you chose what to do with them." 30 days passed with a speed that Maya could only measure looking back after they were already gone. On the 28th day, Arthur delivered the final sample report. She stood in the kitchen reading the document, while Caleb waited on the porch, knowing without needing to be told that something important was being read. The report showed a measurable reduction in mosquito larvae in the gullies, where the frog population had established itself, improved soil permeability along the banks of those stretches, the presence of microorganisms indicating the beginning of biological chain recovery, and, at the oldest point of the experiment, spontaneous sprouting of native grasses that Arthur had photographed and identified as a species not recorded on that soil in more than 6 years, according to the records in her father's notebook. She read that passage twice. Native grasses, species not recorded in 6 years, sprouting now from soil that was beginning to breathe again. She folded the report, placed it inside a folder, and went to the porch. "Caleb," she said. "Yes, Miss Maya?" "The land is being reborn." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the gullies, then back at her. "Then Silas Sterling was right," he said in a low voice. "He always was." The meeting at the bank took place the next morning. This time Maya went alone. She didn't need Arthur to present his report. The document spoke for itself. Mrs. Margaret received her in a different room from the first meeting, smaller, quieter. There was a third person in the room, a tight-lipped man who introduced himself as the head of the Internal Audit Department. She understood immediately that the investigation into Vance and the contact inside the bank had moved forward somehow, even though nobody said so explicitly. She presented Arthur's report calmly. She explained each data point, each analysis, each photo. She showed the timeline, the documentation of the pesticide interference, and the documented impact. Ms. Margaret flipped through the report in silence for what felt like a long time. Then she looked up. "Mrs. Maya, the technical assessment completed by our department, together with the data you provided, is sufficient for us to open a renegotiation of the financing terms." Maya stood still. "What does that mean in practice?" "It means an extended term, an initial grace period, and a review of the rates with the property's recovery plan recognized as alternative collateral." The woman paused. "It means the farm won't be foreclosed on for now." Maya breathed slowly. "There is another matter," Ms. Margaret continued, in a tone that carefully didn't say more than it was saying. "The internal investigation that was opened based on the information you brought is ongoing. I can't comment on the details. But I can say that these situations are taken seriously." Maya nodded. "Can I sign the renegotiation?" "Today, if you like." She signed with the pen the assistant handed her on the indicated line, and her hand didn't tremble. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. She left the bank and stood still on the sidewalk, with the sun beating down hard that August afternoon. She took out her phone and called Mrs. Agatha first. The researcher listened in silence and at the end just said, "Good work." Then she called Arthur, who said he would keep monitoring the ditches for a few more months because the process had yielded data he wanted to follow closely. Then she called Franklin from the cooperative, who celebrated with an enthusiasm that was genuine. And then she stood there, with her phone in her hand, staring at the screen with her sister's contact open. She called. Chloe answered after 2 rings, as if she'd been waiting. "How did it go?" her sister asked, before Maya said anything. "They renegotiated the debt. The farm stays." Silence. Maya. "I know, Chloe. I did wrong. I know I did wrong." Her sister's voice was broken in a way that wasn't an act. I let myself be convinced by a man I didn't know, who told me what I wanted to hear, which was that there was an easy way out. I should have called you first. I should have waited. But I was afraid you were making a mistake that would destroy you, and I tried to protect you the wrong way. Maya was silent for a moment. When we're afraid for someone we love, sometimes we do things we shouldn't, she finally said. I know that. She paused. But you scared me in a way I'm still processing, Chloe. I haven't gotten over it yet. I'm not asking you to get over it. I'm asking you not to throw it away. Maya looked at the sky above the street. There was a high, solitary cloud drifting slowly. I'm not throwing it away, she said. But it needs time. I'll wait as long as you need. They were silent for a moment, and it was a different silence from the ones before. This one had room for both sides to breathe within it. Are you coming to see the farm someday? Maya asked. When you invite me. Then I'll invite you soon. She hung up. She stood still on the sidewalk for another moment, and then she got into the truck and drove home. In the days that followed, the community processed what had happened in ways that reached Maya Sterling indirectly, as always. Vance Thorne's representative had received a formal notice from the Farmers Cooperative regarding the pesticide issue. Abraham and Wyatt had filed their complaints. The internal investigation at First National Rural Bank was underway, and although no one named names, the rumors drifting through the community suggested movement was happening. And Vance Thorne, who had lurked on the sidelines like a vulture for months, withdrew his offer to buy the farm without a formal explanation. When the news reached Maya through Franklin, she received it with a stillness that surprised even herself. Aren't you relieved? Mr. Caleb asked when she told him. I am, she said, but relieved isn't enough. I needed this to stop being a threat so I could focus on the land for real. And now I can. And that's what she did. The following weeks were a different kind of work than she had done before. It was no longer the work of someone racing against time. It was the work of someone starting to build with time on her side, not against her. Arthur came periodically, and each visit brought data that confirmed what she was already seeing with her own eyes. The ditches kept improving. The frog population had spread to areas where she hadn't initially placed them, which meant they were reproducing, which meant the water was good enough to sustain a life cycle. Some mornings Maya would get up before sunrise and stand at the edge of the oldest ditch, where the water was clearest, and just listen. The croaking of the frogs at that hour was different from the wee hours of the night. It was fuller, more varied, like a conversation between many voices that had found a place where they could exist. She thought about her father in those moments, not with that sharp pain she'd felt in the first months after he passed. She thought of him with something that was still longing, but had taken on a different texture, less cutting, warmer. He had left that notebook like someone leaves a map, not a treasure map, the kind you use once and put away. A map of how the land works, how the life within it works, how the balance that was broken can be mended with patience and attention. Maya had learned to read that map. There was one particular morning, about 3 weeks after the bank meeting, that stayed with her in a way different from the others. She was at the ditches with Caleb when he suddenly stopped, crouched down, and pointed to a stretch of the bank that was a bit further off. Look there, Mrs. Maya. She went over to where he was pointing and crouched down too. On a patch of damp soil at the edge of the ditch, between the mud and the grass that was regrowing, there was a small plant she hadn't seen in that spot before. It was a low plant, with rounded, dark green leaves, emerging from the ground, with a firmness that didn't seem to match its size. Old man Silas taught me to recognize this little plant, Caleb said, his voice clearly controlled. It only sprouts in living soil. When it shows up, it means the life has come back to the land. Maya stared at that small plant for a long time. There was something disconcerting about its size. Life had arrived small, discreet, without any announcement. It seemed that after everything, after all those months of struggle and paperwork and the bank and Vance Thorne and nights on the wet ground of the ditch, and the shoulder pain and her sister's betrayal and the soaked notebook and the neighbor's laughter, the land had answered with this. A little plant that most people would walk right past without even noticing. But old man Caleb had noticed, and Caleb had learned from Maya's father to notice. Mr. Silas Sterling taught me that living soil doesn't come all at once, he said, as if she had spoken aloud what she was thinking. He used to say, when you see that first tiny little plant, you've already gotten through the hardest part. The rest is just caring and waiting. He had a lot of patience, Maya Sterling said, more to herself than to him. He did, and you have it too, only yours is different from his. His was calm, like a river that flows slowly. Yours is fierce. She looked at the farmhand. Fierce how? Fierce like someone who doesn't stop even when the ground disappears from under their feet. He paused and looked away toward the drainage ditches. That's a kind of patience too, just the noisy version. Maya laughed. It was a short laugh, a little surprised, the kind that comes out when you weren't expecting to laugh and you do anyway. It had been a long time since she'd laughed like that. Then she stood up, opened the blue notebook she carried in her pocket, and wrote in it. Date, time, exact location along the ditch, description of the plant and what it meant, according to old man Caleb, who learned it from his father, who learned it from the land. The farm wasn't healed. It was far from it. It would take years for the soil to return to the life her father had known decades before. The debt had been renegotiated, but it was still there, with its interest and its deadlines and its demands, and it would have to be paid off with real production in the coming years. There was still so much work, more work than she could see from where she stood. But there was life where there had once been only dry mud. There were frogs in the channels, where before there had only been larvae. There was a small stubborn plant growing on a channel bank, in soil that had begun to breathe again. That afternoon, when the sun was starting to go down and the sky turned that orange only the countryside produces in that way, Maya called Chloe Sterling. Come when you can, she said. I want to show you something in the ditches. What is it? Chloe asked, with a curiosity tinged with relief. There's a small plant growing on a bank that Caleb says Dad would have loved to see. I want you to see it too. A brief silence. I'll come this weekend, Chloe said. I'll be waiting for you. She hung up and stood on the porch looking out at the ditches until the sun completely disappeared behind the horizon. The croaking of the frogs filled the evening air, insistent and constant, as it had always been, and as she was beginning to believe it would be forever again. The land her father had loved was learning to heal, and she had learned along with it that things worth having rarely come without a cost. The cost had been high, higher than she had calculated when she left the air-conditioned office and drove off onto the dirt road. It had been paid with sleepless nights, with the pain in her shoulder that still ached in certain positions, with a betrayal that was still healing, with the humiliation of hearing laughter behind her back as she opened the truck bed. But she had paid, and the land had received. On the last page of the blue notebook that night, she wrote in firm handwriting, "The land does not forget those who care for it truly." Those were her father's words. She had found them in the green notebook he had left behind on the last page, in a shaky but resolute hand. Now she wrote them again, in her own hand, in her own notebook. Because some truths need to be written down in every generation, so they won't be lost. The end. Now tell us what you thought of this story. Do you believe the land can be reborn when it's cared for with patience? Leave it in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.